Thank you very much, Samrat. It's a pleasure to be here with so many friends and colleagues and to begin this discussion of really the central conceptual issues and practical challenges in our field. And we have very limited time today, so really we'll just be putting some issues on the table and I guess some questions and some possible approaches. And I look forward to this continued conversation as we go forward toward the international conference. The questions that were posed to us as participants in this are here, and they have to do with thinking about where our conceptual frameworks come from, what kinds of versions we have been through, and whether they are fit for purpose in the current context of a globalizing world. So I'm going to try to say a few words about each of these things and point to some current work, and then hopefully we'll have a bit of time for discussion. So to begin with, I think we need to acknowledge that the notion of culture itself comes out of a particular history, largely a history of European colonialism, in which there was a contrast made between the cultured or civilized, cultivated peoples of Europe, particularly of Northern Europe, and other people elsewhere, some of whom were portrayed, in fact, as people without a culture. So there is, in the very notion of culture, a potential kind of hierarchy, a kind of colonial us and them that still in some ways carries over into some of our contemporary thinking. And as we'll come to in a moment, that's one of the things we really have to push back against in thinking through what a more post-colonial way is of thinking about culture in context. And in fact, that same conceptual machinery that served colonial interests still plays out in other ways in the current context of transnational capitalism, where culture has become a way for multinational corporations to refine and target their products for particular markets. And I hope that that is something that we can understand both as, I guess, a strategy we can adopt in trying to make our own approaches useful, but also as a serious dilemma and something that contributes to the inequality that Dr. Gunn has already pointed to. The common way that people think about culture in our professions and mental health settings and in many other settings is as a kind of rubric that includes various ways that we divide peoples and communities in terms of ethnicity, in terms of racialized identities, in terms of nations, and so on. And this sense in which human groups are constructed, create their own boundaries and their own sense of identity vis-a-vis other groups is very important for our work, but it's not the most encompassing view of culture. And that's the third thing I have listed here, which is a sort of broader view of the nature of human beings as fundamentally cultural beings, in the sense that we need to develop within a particular community, to develop language, to develop the complex cognitive skills that allow us to construct, co-construct, and adapt to a particular social world. So that sort of a biological fact, in a sense, of who we are, that is, that we're cultural. Yeah, I'm unmuted again now. Is that okay? Can everyone hear me? Just to make sure that I'm not marching along.
I can hear you, Laurence. Yes.
Great. Okay. Maybe Samrat or somebody can show their face, so I'll have that little bit of visual feedback while I'm talking, so I'll know if this goes off the rails. And so one of the challenges of talking to all these beautiful still faces is not knowing exactly where one is. And maybe that's an analogy for some of our dilemmas in intercultural communication. In any event, this larger context of culture is, I think, where we have to begin from in our work, because it lets us then look critically at how these other versions of culture, both the historically difficult one of hierarchies of development that get imposed on groups of people, and the everyday one that we all live with of how different groups are partialed out and created in a global context and within any given society. It lets us look at those as themselves cultural products, not simply the building blocks of culture, but an outcome of social and cultural interactions that create those identities that we're then trying to make sense of in terms of how they shape people's illness experience. So I want to point this out from the beginning to say that where I think we need to start from is with this last description that I've got on the slide of thinking of culture as constitutive of who we are, wherever we are, and as residing not only in our bodies and how we're shaped over development and in our brains in terms of how we become attuned to a particular environment, but in the physicality of our environment, in our institutions, in our daily practices, and so on. So that's part of what we're trying to understand in terms of its impact on mental health and incorporate into our formulation of human problems and potential solutions. And as you can imagine, as we all know, that's a big challenge. I mentioned already this need to push past the hierarchies that have been built into our uses of culture. And as you know, the older literature in cultural psychiatry began with collecting kinds of examples of culture-bound syndromes that were somehow seen as prototypical of problems in particular places that tended to create a very exoticized view. And the other literature that went hand in hand with that was a focus on healing practices and healing rituals, which are often deeply embedded in the religious ideas of a community, in its mythology, and in its aesthetic and artistic productions. So it was very rich and fascinating kinds of processes, but perhaps not getting at the everydayness of people coping with various kinds of adversity, which are really at the center of mental health practice. So contemporary post-colonial, if you will, cultural psychiatry, I think, is very concerned with trying to understand human contexts in all their complexity and not simply circumscribing them under the name of a particular ethnic group or a racialized group and so on, but really seeing them as complex social environments with many cross-cutting forces, globalized forces, larger environmental processes, and so on, all of which are constitutive of who we are. And what that calls us to is not only a very sophisticated view, I guess, of systemic, a kind of systemic thinking of the human, about the human condition, but also a series of ethical, political, and pragmatic questions about whose voices are heard, what modes of self-representation are possible for us and are on the table. So as I mentioned, we have a variety of approaches available to us in cultural psychiatry, going back to the early work in culture-bound syndromes that was tied very much to European exploration and colonization, and then through the many iterations that have occurred in psychological anthropology, medical anthropology, of thinking about the interplay of culture and psychological processes. And then to what I'm going to be emphasizing, which is a kind of hierarchical systems view that gives us a broad and perhaps abstract framework within which to bring together all of the very particular kinds of processes that we're interested in, be they physiological, within the body, within our processing of the environment, psychological in the sense of our own self-understanding and the stories that are constitutive of our identities and our lives, and social in the sense that they reside in interactions among people and with a larger social world and social environment. So this is kind of what we're heading toward. Now, one of the key challenges is that we need a lot of different kinds of pieces of information that somehow have to be fit together in formulating what's going on. And this is just a sort of a very crude reminder of some of those different sources, and which will lead in a moment to the reflection on the fact that we can't get all these from one place. So we're very interested in personal meaning. How do people understand the world? How do they construe their situation, their predicament, and their sense of self and their goals for the future? What is it they want out of helping interaction and so on? Those personal meanings are embedded in and draw from and make creative use of cultural meanings. People are given certain kinds of frameworks, certain kinds of narratives, certain imagery, certain mythology, and so on and so forth that we use as we develop our sense of self. We don't use it whole cloth. We improvise, we push back against it, we create new facets of culture. That's an ongoing process. And nowadays, most of us, in fact, have multiple streams of culture that we're participating in, whether locally or online, and those are important to us. All of that occurs in a social context that is, generally speaking, multi-ethnic, multicultural, and has structural elements that are not simply captured in the nature of cultural ideologies and practices, but have to do with sort of brute facts of material arrangements, of distributions of resources and power, and those larger social structural processes we know are among the powerful social determinants of health. So the key point here, aside from just acknowledging these different dimensions that we try to put together in some way when we give an account of someone's suffering and of what might be helpful to them, that the key point in this slide is that we can't get all of those from the person in front of us. So even though a lot of what we're trying to do is to listen closely to people and to understand their experience in their own terms, people are never fully aware of the systems that they're embedded in. And that's partly just because we all have limited experience, but it's also because there are things about the environment that conspire to hide things, that normalize situations, that normalize arrangements of inequity, for example, that naturalize differences of, let's say, a racialized identity, which is in fact entirely socially, culturally, historically constructed, gets treated as though it's a biological fact about the person. So that kind of mystification makes it hard for someone to perhaps convey to us all the pieces of the puzzle we need. And so we need other sources, whether that's other people in the person's social world, other family members, other people in the community, or whether it's the reflections of social scientists and political scientists and geographers and historians and so on, who are helping us to see the big picture, which we can then use to look at the missing pieces, the things that are not present in the patient's story or things that are entirely taken for granted. So I've made this point because if we come to what is the sort of primary tool that's available to us in terms of current psychiatric technology, at least in the context of North American psychiatry and the US, it's this cultural outline for cultural formulation in the DSM, which was developed by anthropologists and psychiatrists in the process of introducing culture more systematically into DSM-4, and which tries to characterize some of these dimensions that would be important for making a formulation of someone's problem in cultural context. As it's evolved, this includes, as you can see, both issues that are related to the person's own self-understanding and the meanings given to experience by the cultural context, but it also points toward a whole series of social structural issues. But those have not been well elaborated, I would say, in any systematic way in this outline or in the subsequent tools. As you know, with DSM-5, in response to challenges people had in taking up this outline, a major effort was made to develop a cultural formulation interview, partly as a way of demystifying what it takes to get the kinds of information you need to put into that outline, and partly to begin to study how that process works in a more systematic way. And I think this outline is helpful in getting at people's own self-understanding and their view of what's going on, although to really flesh this out takes a lot of time in conversation with people. However, it's been pointed out that this emphasizes the personal meaning and cultural meaning aspects of the person's predicament and does not give as much attention and collect some of the kinds of information we need to really make sense of the person's social structural position and predicament. Here's a broad list of social determinants of health. Really, each of these can be unpacked into many, many subcomponents, some of which, for example, racism doesn't appear here as a separate dimension. It's woven into the social environments and the identities that people have and so on. And this is a list that has been used by the Public Health Agency of Canada. And part of the point here, and we'll be talking about, there's a tension at this current moment in a debate between how far can we get with the cultural formulation and how much do we need a social structural or social processual formulation? And are these alternatives? Is one more valuable than the other? Are they complementary? And the main burden of the slide is just to emphasize that they're actually not two separate things, that social structures are created and maintained by cultural ideologies and practices, that racism exists because we have cultural ideas about identity that lead to segregation of people and subordination of people and so on. So even though the brute fact of being treated with microaggression or being turned away for a place to live or not having the opportunity for a job or being physically attacked by other people, including by the police or other, supposedly protective and pillars of our societies, those brute facts, which are powerful determinants of both physical and mental health, exist within cultural systems of meaning. So it is really not an either or. And I think this is one of the key challenges when we're making sense then of what a person's position is in their social world and how we can incorporate that into a formulation. So this is just to say again that even if we, and I think we, as we should, embrace very seriously the effort to develop structural competence and structural formulations of health problems and mental health problems, in the process, we need to bring to bear all that we've learned from anthropology, from social sciences that study culture and cultural context as a way of getting at the meaning-centered dimensions that both create and maintain these structures. Now, how does that get played out in a formulation? And I should say this is the challenge. We went from having an outline, which is kind of a list of topics, to having an interview that sort of demystifies, okay, where do you get some of that information? Here's some fairly straightforward questions you can ask that would at least begin to populate our outline of important information. But a formulation is not just a list. A formulation is a picture of how things are related to each other, of causal pathways, of influences, of interactions between things. So that's the challenge and I think this is what clinicians use. We always use a partial formulation in which we're thinking in some kind of processual way of what's going on, that certain circumstances are causing certain stressors, and there's a certain physiological and psychological response, and that in turn has consequences in terms of how the person is faring and coping and problem solving, of how other people are interacting. It's all that we're trying to put together, both to characterize the problem and to try to find solutions. So that's an unfinished task. It's an unfinished task in the sense of trying to systematize it in some way, whether it's for teaching and training purposes or whether it's in our everyday work. And in the process of trying to think that through, we have to begin to think very seriously about the different contexts that people live in and how best to characterize them. As I say, I think not nearly enough effort has been put into that within psychiatry and psychology and mental health practices. So here's just a diagram from the last chapter of the handbook on for the cultural formulation interview that sort of acknowledges that we've got these different levels of system processes that we could be thinking about, and we have different facets that we're trying to put together, and the sort of columns represent very roughly a kind of temporal unfolding from the initial causes of a problem to how they're expressed, to how people then cope with them, to what happens when a treatment intervention is made, and to the larger sort of social position a person ends up in, whether they're stigmatized, whether they're reintegrated and they recover, and so on. Another way to look at this temporal dimension is listed below in terms of predisposing, precipitating, perpetuating, and protective factors. It's just another way to conceptualize the temporal frame. And basically in a formulation, one is trying to think of some different levels of processes and some temporal unfolding over time to tell a story, tell a processual or mechanistic story about the health problems of a person. Now, one thing that we get from a sort of social cultural perspective is that these time frames are not simply the time frame of the evolution of an illness or of a set of symptoms. There are larger time frames. There's the developmental and biographical time frame of an individual's life. Where does the health problem sit? But there are also larger social time frames in terms of histories of colonization, histories of the relationships between peoples that are then impacting on that story. So again, that adds another level of difficulty. So in my last few slides, let me just talk a little bit about an approach I think that is trying to put these different things together in some way that I think allows us to borrow from a lot of interesting work that's going on at present. On the left-hand side, this is from a paper that is in process working with the Group for the Advancement of Psychiatry, and Ana Gomez-Carrillo has taken the lead on this, and many of us on this call, Mitchell Weiss, myself, Roberto, others have contributed to this process. And you can see here in this diagram some descriptions of different tools that we currently have available for thinking in a multi-level way about the contributors to health problems and so on. And on the left is kind of a reminder of, I guess, the biopsychosocial approach that many of us were exposed to in training in medical school and in psychology and so on, that just basically serves as a reminder of the hierarchical structure that exists in biological systems, that bodies are made up of components. Those components are made up of smaller components and so on. And the ways those different levels of organization are woven together is really where the interesting dynamics are in what is now called systems biology, where people try to understand the cell, for example, itself as a very complex system with many different components. And something like DNA is not a blueprint for the cell, it's actually a resource that the cell uses to reconstruct itself, just as the cell is something that the brain uses to process information, and the brain is something that societies use to bring groups of people together. So we've got this kind of top-down organization that's important for us to recognize and that we try to use in formulation. You can see the couple of other columns here which have to do with how this kind of hierarchical thinking is being elaborated mainly in biology and systems biology, and also in the USNIMH sort of scheme of how to go about psychiatric research. But what I want to talk about very briefly is a different approach that still deals with these same levels, but really takes them on in a different way. And that's represented in what I've called here an ecosocial systems point of view. This draws from the work of Nancy Krieger in social epidemiology. She used the term ecosocial. It also draws from the work of Uri Bronfenbrenner in developmental psychology, from the work of Gregory Bateson and many other people in anthropology, basically a thinker in family therapy, all the people who have used systems thinking in some ways to come to grips with the human condition. And what this view encourages us to do is to think about the human condition in a slightly different way, as having to do with processes of embodiment that cut across multiple levels, that link basic physiological processes to the social world, to processes of agency that also cut across multiple levels, that have to do with our own psychological functioning, with our social and political position, how much agency and power we are lent or able to mobilize in the social world, and so on, and then with the larger social context. So if we're trying to take that on board, then we have a lot to think about in terms of how language and discourse penetrate into the body, of how our embodied experience reshape the ways we talk and think about experience. And in turn, those processes, and this is sort of a picture of that link between our experience in the middle and the way it's grounded in bodily processes on the one hand, but also in larger discursive practices. And those extend out into the world in a social way, so that ultimately we're trying to make a formulation that links biological and social processes in some kind of way. And in reality, of course, these links and these connections are prodigiously complicated. There's a lot going on. And practically speaking, in clinical work, we're always trying to figure out what's the smallest set I can get away with to begin to describe what's going on and where I could have some leverage. So we know we're always only looking through a keyhole and describing a bit of what's going on. The skill and the kind of research we need and the kind of modes of practice we need is in getting at what are the most important dimensions. And here, this is my last slide. Here's a sort of a scheme for what we're doing. We're listening to people. We're trying to think about their social world. We're using our knowledge of the social world that is informed by the best social science and by our awareness of the current environment we're living in. At this moment, that includes spending a good part of our lives online, staring at small squares of people, and connecting to people all over, so that people far away are close and people who are close maybe in some ways are further away. And we use that to try to begin to characterize a person's problems, which go beyond diagnosis, which include formulating their social predicament in some ways. And those are going to become potential ways of understanding why they're stuck or why they're suffering, and of beginning to devise a response. We try to construct a multi-level process formulation. And that's what was represented here by this sort of flow diagram that, as I say, might just have a few things on it, or it might have a lot. You probably can't see this very clearly, but on the lower right-hand side are a bunch of biological processes that are interrelated. And at the top in the center is, this is coming from a vignette of somebody who's lost their job and is having a lot of social stress. So those are social stressor factors. And on the bottom on the left are psychological processes of how this person is making sense of that predicament. So we can put all these together, not as separate things that are just listed in rows in a table, but that are processually connected. And as I say, the challenge is knowing where to look, what's most important, and what to prioritize. That's, as I say, begins with building this model and building a kind of multi-level approach, and then devising a treatment plan, and then negotiating that with the people we're working with so that in ways what we're doing really responds to what their needs are and priorities are. So I'll end just by saying that I think this is a kind of a picture of where I think we're at in the field very generally, very abstractly. I think the challenge is how to get the specifics of this down. And when we start thinking about a globalizing world, we have to pay close attention to what Samrat already mentioned, this huge and growing inequality around the world. Also the notion that even adopting the language of globalizing is already taking on board a particular kind of economic and ideological view. I like also using the idea of planetarization to sort of remind ourselves that we're in this larger ecological whole that is facing climate change, that is facing huge impacts of our own activities on the environment. And we really have to figure out ways of thinking about that that let us understand the predicaments that people are facing. So I'll stop here, and I hope I haven't gone too badly over my time, and look forward to the discussion.